Hey there, students. It's Mr. Sharp here with my co-host Little Mason here. We're going to talk today about our second segment in Unit 1 colonization, talk about Virginia settlement and the rest of the settlement of the southern colonies. As we go forward today, I want you guys to remember our big essential question. Why do people move? So today we're going to be talking about how people made both voluntary and involuntary movements to North America to settle colonies, particularly for English settlements. So now we're getting into everything that leads up to Jamestown and Plymouth colonies, everything that's English settlement versus Spanish and French. So, and also want you to remember voluntary versus involuntary movements, like this voluntary movement of me going across the water. So let's get into it. Last time we spoke, we talked about mercantilism and triangle trade. This generated a lot of wealth for the European nations, but particularly for men of power, men of royal stature, or men of high degree. So for the average person living in England who was working a job or an artisan or a laborer, their wages were going down, particularly because if you weren't a skilled tradesman and the labor that you once held is probably not as desirable as it once was. So starting in the 1500s, the wages steadily decreased and keep on decreasing until about 1650, until it started to rise again. However, this drop in wages was going to push a lot of Englishmen to find new opportunities, and this is for men who are not of high class or not of royalty. These are going to be men of opportunity, men who want to make money just to make a living. So where do they go? So between 1610 and 1660, over 200,000 people made the journey from England all across the Atlantic to the Americas. Now, most people would go to the West Indies because, like anybody else, if you're going to go somewhere, you'd rather go to the beach, because living in the Caribbean islands at this time would have been a very luxurious way of living. Labor would have been difficult because of the heat, but for somebody from England, you wouldn't have to worry so much about that, and you can live in the colony and live life fine. No, not many people are going to want to come to the Chesapeake Bay area at the start, and you're going to see why here. So before we jump into anything, if you're following along with the notes, please pause this video so you can take this down, and also remember what you need to be looking for as we go through this segment. So what are the push factors for the English colonies? Before the settlement of Jamestown, there were a couple of attempts at creating an English settlement, but they were all unsuccessful. One was a failure in being able to start it up. The second one, which we know famously as the Roanoke Colony or the Lost Colony, was funded by a famous man called Sir Walter Raleigh, and it was abandoned after 3 years of returning. As the leaders returned, they found that the colony was completely gone. Just nothing was left. So this kind of scared a lot of people from going and making big settlements from England. However, in 1607, a joint stock company in England is going to fund an expedition for settlers to go create a settlement purely for gaining profits. So shareholders would invest money into this company to purchase the needs for the settlers, and they would go across the Atlantic and land in a place called the Chesapeake Bay Area and build a colony that was relatively hard to find in the swampy area, so they wouldn't be seen by Spanish ships, and they would attempt to build a colony. Keyword, attempt, because not only that, they would face a lot of devastations, including their landing right in the middle of one of the biggest Native American empires in North America, known as the Powhatan Nation. This was a loose confederacy of tribes that were joined together by Chief Powhatan at the time. His name is not really Chief Powhatan, but it's the best source that we have. And he's also famous for, well, before I tell you that, this is the area that the English landed in, right in the heart of the Powhatan Confederacy. But Chief Powhatan is famous for being the father of the famous Pocahontas, which you remember from the Disney movie. However, the Disney movie doesn't quite get it right. When I say quite, they don't get it right at all. So, why do we know about Pocahontas in this story of Jamestown? Is supposedly said that from a diary entry by the military advisor of the colony called Captain John Smith, that he was captured and taken before the chief, and they were about to execute him before the chief's daughter Pocahontas saved him. However, this was probably a staged kidnapping to show dominance over the English by Chief Powhatan, but Pocahontas is going to become more relevant in the story as we go further into this discussion. So, about the colonists. The first colonists that came within this first year, many of them died. Out of the 120 or so that came, only 38 had survived all that first year in what's known as the starving times. They were prone to diseases in a swampy area. Not only that, but they didn't bring a lot of agricultural materials or livestock with them. They wanted to purely work to mine for gold until John Smith, who became the leader after a while, told them, if you're not going to work, you're not going to eat. He finally told these people, if you're not going to farm, then go ahead and die. And not only that, but they developed really poor relations with the Powhatan Nation, causing a lot of attacks. So it seems like this company is going to be a failure. However, within just a couple of years, a man by the name of John Rolfe will make the trip over and see the devastation in the colony and decide, I'm going to do something. So he plants this plant, that which was actually illegal for Englishmen to have at this time because Spain controlled the trade, but he would start to plant tobacco seeds. And because of the warm climate in the Chesapeake Bay Area, the tobacco plant would become very well received in the colony, and it becomes the #1 cash crop in Jamestown overnight. So from 1607 to 1616, even though it didn't turn a profit after this year, it would turn a huge profit for England. A huge profit. Nothing sells like drugs. Yep, still same true 400 years ago. Not only that, but you're going to need laborers to come and help you with the tobacco planting. So as England starts to solve the problem for the labor, they would institute systems like the Headright system, which would grant 50 acres to anybody who would be able to franchise their own indentured servants to come over. They would give them 50 acres of land to plant as long as they brought their own indentured servants. So what's an indentured servant? Is somebody who is a contracted laborer to work for you for a certain period of time. It could be 20 years, it could be 40. But once that time is up, you would be able to be released from your contract and live within the colonies and probably own your own lands. So this was the primary means of labor until 1619, when another pivotal moment in American history is going to occur. About 20 African slaves from Western Africa were brought into Jamestown as laborers. Even though they were not the primary source of laborers at the time, it would eventually become the most controversial and the most reliable system of labor for southern colonies from this point on. And this is going to lead into a lot more discussion and a lot more debate as we go through this course. But this is the starting point, 1619, when those first 20 arrived. However, as Jamestown started to become more successful, this also brought bad news to Native American tribes within the Powhatan Nation. Not only did disease overcome many of the people living in this area, but the expansion of farms and farm animals completely devastated many Native American lands. Native Americans didn't believe in this idea of private owned property. So the tobacco fields took up a lot of farming land, drove away a lot of game. And also, not only that, but the livestock like cows and pigs tear up fields, and they will tear up many of the Native American lands that were used for farming. So this drives out many Native American tribes living in the area. And by 1619, the colony has done so well that they establish a House of Burgesses, which is going to establish the first representative style of government in America, where the colonies can make decisions on their own instead of having England making all the decisions for them. So this is a picture of Jamestown as it is in 1625. It's really well established. However, in those first years, remember, it was struggling. It was a small fort, would have been this size, but overnight it booms and it grows. And this is going to be eventually the DC area that we know of today, that very populated area. There's a picture of an indentured service contract. They would call it indentured because you would literally indenture the contract. It would be ripped at the bottom here, so that way the laborer could hold one contract, and the person who owned that contract would have the other. It was a written agreement. And throughout the years into 1660, more settlements would begin to flourish throughout the James River, more settlements, more homes, more farms, more plantations. And this is also what grows the plantation style of life that we see in the Southern way of life all throughout American history. Here's some pictures of a tobacco plant field, very profitable. My grandfather actually grew tobacco when he was a younger man, and it's still a very profitable crop in the States. But it's called a cash crop for a reason. It's a cash crop because it's grown not for its nutritional value, you can't eat it, but it's for its luxury value. You smoke it, you don't eat it. Oop, going the wrong way here. And also with the grace of tobacco, many of the prices and the demand for it is going to be so high, the price will become relatively available for everybody, and it becomes a more custom thing to do in England is to smoke American-grown tobacco. Also create lung disease. Anyway, this is also going to be on your notes, guys. Make sure you take some notes down for about the Headright system, cash crop, and relations with Native Americans. Now let's move forward. Some pictures of what you may have lived in when you were in the Jamestown area in a little home. And as the colony began to grow, also it led into more territories across the southern colonies, particularly into Maryland. And this is where we're going to talk about the rest of the southern colonies developing. So, with the success of Jamestown, the colony will eventually be labeled as Virginia to celebrate the supposed virginity of Queen Elizabeth I, supposedly. But this is also going to lead to more colonies be established in the South for both religious and profit purposes. So, for example, for Maryland, this would be known as a proprietor colony, meaning that it was owned essentially by one person. He would be the proprietor of this colony. So under the lordship of Lord Baltimore, they would settle a settlement particularly for Catholics who were being persecuted in England, so they wanted a place for Catholics to go to where they can escape that persecution. In addition to that, in 1670, as people started to go beyond Virginia and into the Carolinas, you would see that there would be a brand new colony, a huge colony that encompasses both North and South of Carolina into what's called the Carolina colony, with Charlestown being the capital. Charlestown eventually being Charleston in South Carolina. However, the colony does split in 1729 by the rules of the differing royal governors to make administration easier over the colonies. And you'll see North Carolina takes that part of land that we see today, while South Carolina takes the rest that it is today. And the last one, Georgia. In 1732, as Spanish Florida is beginning to grow, England wants to make sure that there's a cut between English and Spanish colonies. So Georgia is established as a buffer colony between Spain and England. And it's going to be known as a royal colony, meaning that governorship of the colony is directed by the royalty in England or the king. And some pictures of what those colonies will look like as they develop over time. Again, remember that Carolina was one big colony in 1629 until it split in this year, making South and North Carolina as we know it today. Maryland being the escape for Catholics who wanted to escape persecution in England. Virginia being the huge colony that was first developed from Jamestown as its capital until it was moved to historic Williamsburg, as we see it today in Georgia, being that buffer colony between England and Spain, Spanish Florida, which is south of here. And a picture of Charlestown as it stands today. Many of the buildings that, if you've ever been to Charlestown, is very similar to what it would have been like back in the day. So Charleston still tries to maintain its look of a historic city and a very easy port. And this was the reason why it became the colony, because of its port allowing ships to come in. So this concludes our lesson for Southern colonization. Join me again next time for Plymouth Colony and New England settlement. See you then.